The thing about hip hop today is it's smart. It's insightful. The way that they can communicate a complex message in a very short space is remarkable. And a lot of these kids, they're not going to be reading the New York Times. That's not how they're getting their information.
My hip hop will rock and shock the nation. Hip hop culture is more than music.
Teach the youth and speak the truth. Show 'em what peace can do when they're reached for you.
My hip hop will rock and shock the nation. Rap is something you do. Hip hop is something you live.
So hip hop didn't invent anything, but hip hop reinvented everything.
Peace and love, everyone. My name is Manny Faces. For 10 years, I covered hip-hop music and culture in and around New York City as an independent journalist and content creator. What I found was a thriving, bubbling, evolving artistic and cultural ecosystem that most of the media, hip-hop or otherwise, was ignoring. Among the assortment of pioneers and new jack artists, venerable hip-hop institutions and event series, and activity all along the spectrum of hip-hop's elements, I began to find people and organizations that were using hip-hop in non-traditional ways. In education and schools, in youth outreach and counseling, in theater and tech and politics and activism. Again, often terribly underreported, even by so-called hip-hop media. What I began to see was that more than just using music to relate to young people, hip-hop was being used to open doors to many who have had their ideas overlooked, dismissed, or disregarded. Hip-hop is helping tap into these brilliant people and their brilliant ideas, many of which have the potential to benefit society in valuable ways. Looking at the state of our union, I believe we need all the help we can get. I believe that hip-hop can save America. To help prove it, I started this podcast. So thank you for joining me as I talk to the movers and shakers who are responsibly using hip-hop music and culture to address, adjust, and in some cases, alleviate problems that are facing our country. Hip Hop Can Save America is a presentation of the Center for Hip Hop Advocacy at hiphopadvocacy.org, a nonprofit dedicated to increasing public understanding of hip hop culture. We're also brought to you by the award-winning Newsbeat podcast. It's hard-hitting journalism, including interviews with thought leaders and activists about the most pressing social justice issues of our time. And it also incorporates hip-hop, with music and original lyrical contributions every episode. Think of it as Democracy Now! And Black Thought had a podcast baby. You can find Newsbeat by Maury Creative Studios wherever you get your podcasts or on the web at usnewsbeat.com. Hip Hop Can Save America airs weekly, Tuesdays at 10 p.m. on Bonfire Open Source Radio. With amazing programming like their flagship morning show TK in the AM, Bonfire Open Source Radio is leading community radio into the future. Check them out at bonfireradio.com or on the TuneIn app. We're also available on most podcast platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Stitcher. This episode, we're taking a look at hip-hop and school counseling. Those who may be less familiar with the depth and nuances of hip-hop music and culture might think that these two worlds are incompatible. How could a genre with music that revolves around materialism, misogyny, partying, drug use, and violence possibly be beneficial in a school setting, much less one that's supposed to help students in their time of emotional distress? Well, that's not all that hip-hop's about. And the 2016 New York State School Counselor of the Year agrees. He has the receipts to show for it. Dr. Ian Levy brought together these worlds as a counselor at New Visions Charter High School for Advanced Math and Science in the Bronx. As of our talk, he was lecturing at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and has since taken a position back in the BX as assistant professor of school counseling at Manhattan College. Levy, who's been recognized for piloting the development, implementation, and evaluation of a hip-hop-based counseling framework in urban schools, examines mental health practices in those schools, interrogating the role of the school counselor and other school staff to ensure the emotional lives of young people are adequately addressed. His work's been featured on CNN and the New York Times, but most important, he's used hip-hop to help kids. Lots of them. So if your idea of hip-hop starts and stops at radio rap, I encourage you to check out my talk with Dr. Levy and all the episodes of this podcast as I explore the people and organizations who are using hip-hop music, culture, and spirit in innovative, inspiring, and often surprising ways. Let's keep it going. Here's my talk with Dr. Ian Levy.
Thanks again for spending some time with me today. As many of us do when it comes to education and the counseling, the various things that you do, how do you currently kind of define who you are from a professional standpoint?
So right now I consider myself a counselor educator. So I've taken this plunge into this new role where I've shifted from being a direct practitioner of counseling services. I worked for upwards of 5 years in New York City schools as a school counselor. And now I work in the business of training school counselors to go into schools and deploy culturally relevant counseling services and learn how to advocate for both themselves and students in schools.
Right. I think the culturally relevant is such an interesting angle. Obviously, as we talk about hip hop and education and bringing cultural relevance into schools, into counseling environments, that's obviously the focus of what I'm trying to learn a little bit more about and help people learn more about. How do you describe the state of this field, this counseling? What are you trying to get across as you begin this journey of instructing other counselors and other people in this field? What are some of the key takeaways or bullet points that you're really focused on?
Totally. So it's multifaceted. For the role specifically, our role as school counselors has developed significantly over time, originating from a place of really being a person in the school who helps students make sure that academically they're on point and focused on what they need to be focused on. And then over time, we've learned the importance of addressing socio-emotional of students learning as well. And now our field exists in this place where we're ideally supposed to be able to address the personal, social, the academic, and the career interests and points of development for young people in schools. So this multifaceted role of the school counselor is really what I'm trying to push forward to my students as they enter schools, who will most definitely have very different understandings of what their role is. So because our profession has literally transformed over the last 60 years dramatically, a lot of schools don't know what a school counselor is. And so our roles will be differently defined depending on what district you're in, what city you're in, what school you're in. And it's really vastly different. And so being prepared to advocate for your role is a huge component of what it means to be a school counselor in today's world. And ultimately, because if we're not able to advocate for our role, then we're never going to be able to provide adequate services. We might be viewed as bureaucratic pawns who are just filling out paperwork and getting stuff done, and not supposed to be running, groups, group counseling services with young people, or engaging in in-depth individual counseling services with young people, if that's what we need to do in our school. You know what I mean? So it really is important that school counselors are able to individually define their work and advocate for their work in schools, which will not, when they enter them, understand what they're supposed to actually be doing.
Interesting. From a layman terms, I'm not a counselor, I'm not a social worker, I'm not into this field, but doesn't that make sense? Isn't that the way it should be, where you're being very specific towards the environment or the students, how they see the world, and how you're trying to put that focus on how you counsel them and how you deal with them? Isn't that?
Yeah. So from a counseling standpoint, absolutely, right? So in sessions and in groups, I'm always going to make sure, which is why hip hop is so beautiful, make sure that I can use different approaches to counseling that allow young people to lead that process and for us to adapt our work to respond directly to the lives of young people. That, unfortunately, is different than this fact that, if I go into a school to be a school counselor, there are folks that are going in and are ready and prepared and have the skills to do excellent, really hands-on counseling work, right? And so what I mean by that is individual counseling, group counseling work. But their school might say, okay, well, in our school counselors don't do that. In our school counselors have to help us with getting tests ready and administrating tests in the school. We need you to manage really big pieces of data and look at grade point averages for your cohort and be able to report that out to other people in the school. So they might, it should be in some way part of our role, right? But not all of it. And oftentimes, because our roles aren't understood, even if we have these great tools, we're not able to use them. And so that's what I mean, I guess, by this need to be able to advocate for your role the way that you see it. And of course, in sessions, yes, we want to be able to utilize counseling modalities that are youth-driven and go where young people need to go and can be adapted and tailored to the specific needs of the young people we're working with. But we face, beyond that, this larger sort of systemic concern around what our role is in schools.
Interesting. Got it. So let's talk about hip-hop in your field, or how you've incorporated hip-hop into your work. Just give a 50,000 foot view of how you've been incorporating hip hop, how hip hop has been one of the methods that you've been using with success?
Totally. So for me, hip hop has been a platform through which I've delivered counseling, like direct individual or group counseling services to young people in schools. So I've taken this idea of lyric writing and performing and look at those as like naturally cathartic processes for any artist, right? Like it's a space for folks to condense thoughts and feelings and relay them to an audience. And oftentimes we use that process to talk about thoughts and feelings that we've never talked about before. And so because I had seen that, in personal experiences in MC, but also just like from interacting with friends who are MCs, that hip hop culture allowed people to open up in ways that they would not in other settings, that it was the sort of perfect medium to bring into counseling services in schools. And so for me, I worked hard to develop a studio space in the school. So my actual counseling office, for the latter 3 years, it took a while to really get it going and have it like fully fleshed out. But for the past 3 years of my work prior to now, transitioning into UMass Boston, I was working at a school, at a charter school in the South Bronx, and I had a full recording studio in my office, and I worked with students to create emotionally themed mixtapes every year, at least one, sometimes more, where we would have group counseling processes that each topic that we would discuss in a group counseling session, if it was self-doubt or if it was police brutality or if it was fear or stress, any of those themes could be discussed because the young people knew that once they discussed them, they'd be able to write lyrics, record songs, perform songs, put songs online that sort of were about those emotional concerns. So it allowed me this pathway into their worlds and allowed me to help them sort through these thoughts and feelings. And oftentimes in writing, when you write a song, you want it to be really concise. You want your concept to be on point. You want the audience to understand what you're talking about, which means that you can't write a really good song about fear unless you really understand what fear means to you, right? And so that then allowed me this perfect platform to really say, well, where does this fear come from for you, right? To engage in that almost like traditional talk therapy that you would engage in,
right?
But for the sole purpose of then just helping them craft better lyrics, right? Better bars that could engage an audience. And then working on performances and how do you move on a stage in a way that represents the content of your song. If you're talking about fear in a verse or you're talking about perseverance in a verse, like how does your performance look different? How do your vocal inflections sound different to really relay those messages? On the surface, helping young people just like make fire tracks, but like at this deeper level, right? At this deeper level, helping them refine their own understanding of their emotional experiences, their ability to communicate their these emotional experiences to the world in ways that they might not have been comfortable doing prior.
Right. And I think that when we talk about hip hop being used in these settings, to those who are relatively unfamiliar or haven't seen this in practice or hadn't really thought much of it, and I think there's that perception of what rap is, what rap music is to the general public. And very often when you say the words hip hop and you merge it with education, they often think that it's not compatible.
Right.
How surprised were you maybe when you first started maybe experimenting with this? Or actually, what was it like when you first started doing this to see how students were able to take this medium that they're familiar with in the entertainment world and use it in this way?
Yeah, I don't even know if surprised is what I would say, because for me, it was like, this is what like a cipher looked like. Like,
Right.
Legendary ciphers, right? So Legendary Cipher,
Sure.
Massive, amazing cipher, Union Square Park, right? I'm there at Legendary Ciphers. I hear one person randomly in a cipher start, spitting a bar about issues with his father. And immediately this like almost like domino effect, this like cascade of bars follow from other participants about issues with their family instantaneously. So it's like, this is something that's happening already in hip hop.
And organically.
And it's what hip hop is about. Like, hip hop literally was created to push back against larger systemic issues and forms of repression. And it was about people putting tensions aside and coming together to talk and build, right? And push back against stressors and struggles in their lives, right? And so naturally, I've made this argument, as have others in the field of hip hop therapy, that hip hop in and of itself is cathartic, we could say. Now, when we transfer this cathartic process to a traditional, I guess, counseling space, I can start now like building on that natural catharsis. Like if I say write a song about stress, young people already are down to do that because they might A, have already done that, or B, like that. Of course, like sure, like I can find Jay-Z songs where he writes about stress. So like it's not uncommon to address emotional concerns in hip hop. That's a very like normal thing to do culturally. But now because that's happening, like I said before, we as counselors are able to like then build skills on top of that. So I'm then allowed to say, like, oh, okay, cool. Like this bar you're talking about, you know, a struggle with your father. Like what is that like? What are those struggles? I can then engage in more direct conversations with the individual as they're emoting through this natural sort of community defined catharsis through this songwriting process, right? I can build on top of that, build skills on top of that. So I wouldn't say surprised. I was, the things that surprised me, I think, were not necessarily like their willingness to engage in the work, but how the work naturally developed in our schools. So like one of the things we talk about as in the field of mental health generally is working with young people, particularly young people of color, in developing help-seeking behavior. So if something is going on for me, like knowing who I can go to talk about that thing. And there's a lot of reasons, like stigma is why that doesn't happen. The fear of being perceived as weak or vulnerable is a reason why, you know, folks are not willing to just open up to other people. But this process or this space within the school, the studio, quickly became known naturally in the school community as the place to go to talk about things without me even having to push that. And so I'll share a quick little like story, if that's cool, where I had been running my program for a year, okay, and it went really well, and my students put out this really, really dope mixtape called the Hoodies Up mixtape, which paid sort of homage to Trayvon Martin, but then it was also the year that we had lost Eric Garner and Mike Brown, and because the media was like really flooded with these images, naturally the group sessions that we were running were focused on that. And so we wrote a lot of songs that were centered around social justice issues concerning police brutality, and they called the album Hoodies Up. And it was awesome. And so I had this really, really great process with this group of young men and women in my first year at this school. The summer came, the next year started. It was the first week of school. I worked with ninth graders, so I had 150 new ninth graders, and I didn't know all of them yet. And it was literally the first week of school. And this one student comes up to me, and he's like, you know, I heard that I could come like record a song with you, and like this, we're in the hallway. He's like, my cousin just passed away and I want to work on a track with you about it. I don't know who this kid is. It's the ninth grade. It's the first week of school, right? So I was like, yes, please come to me at lunch. So he came to me at lunch, and I was like, how did you find out about the space? And he was like, oh, and he shouted out one of my students, AJ, from the year before. He's like, oh, AJ told me. So he had been like somewhere at lunch or somewhere in the school and had been talking to another student in the school who said, oh, you're going through something, like go to the studio, right? So there was this natural, like I'm not even pushing this at this point, right? It's become entrenched in the community where now this is the place to go. And we have now, at that point, AJ was a 10th grader. We have 10th graders modeling, being the model for help-seeking behavior, right? Like, oh, let me talk to AJ about what I should do about this emotional struggle. Because he has been able to deal with that, right? And because AJ, this is a new ninth grader, it's the first week, but he knows that this album came out the year before because the kids have it online and it's like the talk around school, and they know that the focus of the album is this emotional stuff, and so it becomes natural. It just became this like built-in part of the experience, and so in the school for students. And so this student came, we wrote this awesome track. He had lost a cousin of his whose name was Nana, and so he chose Kanye's Hey Mama beat, and he wrote a song called Hey Nana, and it was super dope and really, really tough for him, but really amazing. And he wound up asking me if his sister could come after school. His sister was older and went to a different school, if she could come after school and record the hook, like on the verse. And so him and I wrote this track. His sister pulled up after school, recorded the hook, and they played the song at the memorial service that weekend. He came back and like told me all about it. And then like his family had heard the song, and it was just like this moment where like all I did was create a space, you know what I mean? And the students, because they knew that they could make it their own, the students took it where it needed to be taken, and they used it how it needed to be used in their lives. And it wasn't me doing anything there other than being available. And there's so many other moments like that. And so I think if there's any surprise, it's not about the effectiveness of it, but it's about what this can morph into and how this can really shift school culture and change the way that young people, A, interact with schooling, period, but B, interact with like difficult emotions and like aren't scared to address them and are actively seeking pathways to talk through difficult thoughts and feelings.
And the fact that, you know, a student is talking to another student about this, that may have never happened before. They,
Right.
to even go to another student sort of as a mentor or somebody who is familiar with your program,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a great side effect as well, because now you have, interpersonal relationships being built as well.
Yeah. And not even a thing like, again, like it wasn't like I said to my students, go find. So I didn't say
Right.
be this much, but what I did say, actually, now that we're thinking about this, which is amazing, was, XXL has the freshman class every
Sure.
year. So, and we can feel however we feel about the current freshman classes and all this stuff. But aside from the fact there's a freshman class of folks every year. So I took this idea of like, yo, you guys are the 10th graders. You have literal freshmen coming in the school. I need you to find me the freshman class for the club this year. And so there was that. What I meant by that was like, find out who can spit or is interested in spitting and bring them to me. That was kind of what I meant. But they found it anyway. And so I think because they were given this responsibility of, okay, you got to find like the next crew. You guys were the inaugural group, and like you need to find who the next group is.
Right.
Because the focus of the work was naturally emotional, they also found students who were dealing with significant emotional concerns beyond just if somebody could spit or not, which is awesome. Yeah.
Absolutely. And what I love about this, sort of a side note, but what you're doing is great for obviously the students and the counseling setting and all of this, but it's also good for hip hop.
Yeah.
Because it's letting young people know that, hey, listen, there's the party, there's the radio songs, there's the entertainment value, but this thing of ours, this thing of yours can still be used, this way. Yeah. And I think that even in just a little bit at a time, every bit of that helps. So your school might have been, very open to it, but I'm sure you might have had some hurdles along the way, either there or with other incorporations of hip hop and education. Maybe you've heard from peers and colleagues. What are some of the, hindrances to incorporating hip hop into these fields? Like, I know there's institutional stuff. There's people who don't get it. Sometimes administrations. Generally speaking, what do you think are some of the problems with being able to start these programs and keep these programs going?
Yeah. So for me, one of the big concerns that I ran into initially, because I said like I had this studio kind of up and running like fully in the last 3 years, but I did this work for almost 5, really 6 before I was even full-time working in the school. When I first started doing this work, I did an after-school program at the Evander campus on Gun Hill Road. And I would pull up to this school and bring my studio equipment with me. Like I had like a portable mic and I was on the subway with like a mic stand. And I had like a laptop in my backpack. And I ran this, like the only time that this principal was trying to give me was after school, which is a normal, like if you're bringing something innovative, they're like, cool, great. You can do it during lunch or after school, which is like, what student wants to sacrifice their lunch block and what student wants to stay after school, right? Like these are not ideal times at all to run something. And so that's what happened initially. So I was doing this after school program only. Then when I got to these other spaces full time, it was still only after school, right? That was it. And I remember one time before in an older school, so before the school that I was at in the South Bronx, I was at a school in Brooklyn. And I did a hip hop lesson one day that was so amazing. Like it was so good. And the class was like bouncing off the walls. Like we were loud, but not loud in a distracting kind of a way, but loud in like a just super engaged, like hip hop kind of way. And I came out of the class and my administrator was like, that was really loud. You guys need to like be quiet. You need to like calm it down next time. And almost had like assumed that it didn't go well just based on volume. So there's always like a lack of understanding also of like what expression looks like through hip hop and how it can be perceived as like, oh, these individuals are engaging in hip hop, like that's dangerous or that's loud or that's like disorderly or, so there's a lot of these negative connotations that go with understandings of hip hop, particularly from folks who are not part of hip hop culture. And that is a hindrance as well. Then when I finally got to my previous school in the Bronx, I ran after school but it got so popular after school that we would stay from after school started around like 4:30 and it could run until 6, and they literally would have to kick us out of the building at 6. Like they were trying to close the building and we were all still there. And I'm talking like 20 kids deep, like till 6 p.m. And we're hanging out, and it was so popular and so powerful that I eventually was able to, this is why I say school counselors have to be able to advocate for their roles, say to my principal, listen, I have this interest. I need this during the day. And I figured out how to finagle it based on my experience with music and the fact that I was in a charter school to actually start a music elective class. So I had a scheduled class called Hip Hop Lyricism, which was on student schedules for the next 2 years. And they were able to literally enroll in these classes. And so I had a block period during the day where I could do this work. But was not able to do that until I sort of like proved its worth through using these other spaces like lunch and after school. And even still during that process, there were so many moments where like, I think one of the challenging things about this work that I realized through doing this work is that like, schools, generally speaking, urban schools in particular, are like radically uncomfortable places for young people because they're not designed to meet them where they are, generally speaking. And so you have young people walking into schools and they don't feel like they belong. They might be forced to walk through like metal detectors when they walk into the school. So they might be feeling like they're labeled as like threats or criminals. Like there's a bunch of different thoughts and feelings that are negative that go through an individual's head when they're walking into a school that doesn't understand them or appreciate them or value them or honor them. When you create a space like a really awesome hip hop studio and a counselor's office, it flips that whole thing on its head. So we had students in my room. They were so connected to the work. They were so comfortable. They were so authentic that when they left that room and had to go back to like a math class that didn't engage them in the same capacity, they were just not having it, right? So like they would start trying to flex in those spaces in the way they could in my room, and that was not going over well with teachers. And then eventually words would start to get back to administration. And of course, when this is heard, admin has to step up and protect their teachers, you know, or at least that's what they perceive they have to do. So they do that. And what that means is, okay, Mr. Levy, you know, really doing the work he's supposed to be doing with students. He's just making hip hop music. He's not teaching them how to really like work on behaviors and bring them to our classroom spaces. When the reality was, I was teaching them how to be themselves in school. But there was still an area of growth for me there, which is that whether it's code switching or what it is, but like, okay, yes, you can be yourself in my room, but when you get to this other room, even if you can't be yourself, you need to figure out how to put on whatever face you have to put on just to get through it. Or we have to figure out what that looks like, right? Like, I mean, that's open to debate. I don't even like that approach of just settling and dealing. I'm not really even a huge advocate of that. But the fact is that was an area of growth and still is an area of growth for me as well. And something that I didn't expect. Like, I was just like, I want to go into school and create amazing spaces for young people. But I didn't realize that when you do that, it shines a light even stronger on all the other spaces in school where they can't be themselves. Right. So like they were like so comfortable in my room that they were like, yo, school is BS. Like I can't, you know what I mean? Like, right. Why can't it always be like this? Why is there only one period where I can feel this way? You know, and that was such an important moment.
So part of the challenge, I think, is taking these ideas and not just having them applied in the counseling setting or in the, you know, behavioral work, but because it can apply in other fields. Absolutely. It can apply in math and science. Yes. And as we know, you know, right.
Absolutely. And then that's what it is, right? Like my mentor, Dr. Christopher Emden's doing ridiculously awesome work in the world of science education using hip hop. And so like and that's what hip hop ed as a group, right? And as an entity is focused on, right? Is really like bringing hip hop culture into every aspect of schooling. And that's why the work is so important. From a school counseling standpoint, also, like it makes me think of this sort of modern understanding of what a school counselor is supposed to be. We're supposed to be able to deliver school-wide interventions and collaborate with educators. And so there's work that I in training my school counseling students to, if they're doing something effective, collaborating with teachers to see how they can assist teachers maybe in implementing the different types of strategies in their classrooms that allow students to feel the same way they feel in these counseling spaces. Right? And so there's ways, that collaborative approach and that effort, but that has to be something that's championed by administration, and there generally has to be a really, really strong understanding and appreciation for hip hop culture, for youth culture, which I would say is hip hop culture, right? And if at the core the school is not trying to do that, then you're consistently going to run into barriers everywhere you are, right? And so school-wide approaches are key, and I think that is something that becomes really apparent, for anybody doing great work in an isolated classroom or counseling office. You start to see how students react to other aspects of schooling when you just have like this one dope space, and it shows us that we need school-wide approaches.
Yeah, well, I think every time, someone like yourself, and obviously you talk about Dr. Emden, Dr. Ejapon, the fellas that I know that are doing this work, every time you guys show successes, I think it does certainly probably help the cause.
Yep.
One question, because I think that a lot of people may find value in what you're doing in certain communities and certain schools, like you mentioned. How much do you think that this kind of mentality, this hip hop incorporation, I know what I would say, but I want to hear it from you, can help in communities that aren't typically associated with hip hop, that aren't typically inner city or urban or, black and brown. Is there a more universal potential for what you're working with?
Absolutely. I think that if you don't come from hip hop, right, if you don't understand hip hop and you go and try to look up what hip hop is, and you look on television and you look in certain spaces, you're only going to see a sliver of what hip hop is, right? You're only going to be able to gather typical perceptions of hip hop, right? The guns, the violence, the drugs, right? Which are components of hip hop culture, and that's fine, but it's not all of hip hop culture. And so I think what this work has the potential to do for non-hip hop spaces is to allow folks to understand the complexities of hip hop culture at a deeper level, and then subsequently understand the complexities of youth culture and urban communities, at a deeper level. And I think it really becomes like this work around helping folks cultivate an appreciation for and an empathetic understanding of like the different circumstances and situations that folks are in this world, and their experiences. I think hip hop is like the best way to communicate experiences for anyone. And so I think that you can engage in a lot of that work in like traditionally like white or non-hip hop schools. I also think the last thing is that there's also vast potential for really, really critical race-related work using hip-hop as the medium as well, that I'm yet to dive into, but am in definite like planning stages and considering how to help like particularly white folks look at their white racial identities in some capacity related to hip hop, or analyzing what stereotypes they hold or prejudices they hold to other communities, and using hip hop as like an anchor for that discussion.
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating way to look at it as well. Plus the techniques of hip hop. I mean, first of all, white kids listen to rap. They rap. They know all the things. Yeah. And to let them use the same songwriting techniques that you do. I mean, I think that's universal. I think that can be applied everywhere. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think the content is different, but and that's why I think like race becomes important, because I've done it. I've gone into white schools, predominantly white schools, to engage in work like this, and you'll hear young people start talking about like, all the things that you would, that are stereotypical, like being on a block or like, doing certain types of drugs or engaging in certain types of behaviors that, or have a pretty good feeling that they're not engaging in.
Right.
But that then becomes a critical around like, why do you feel like that's what you have to talk about? And what does that mean? Like, so there's so many ways to really engage in the work. But that's why I think race and like understanding perceptions of other individuals in this world via hip hop as that medium to understand those folks or different folks, I think is really important.
I think that's one of the, and one of the overarching themes that I'm trying to get at with obviously this podcast and some of the work that I do is try to amplify that message, because I think we know that to save America, to save our society, what we do need is better understanding empathy, perspectives, sharing those things. I think that could just help generally. So I know that, as you might agree, hip hop is a great vehicle for that across all demographics. So I value that. I'm going to wrap up with you. I want to ask you one thing, sort of as a piggyback of that. You tweeted, this was your tweet. You said, hip hop is vibranium. You said, colonizers will try and steal it and create fake versions of innovative work in schools. We owe it to students to help them harness their brilliance and protect their hip hopness as they grow. And of course, this was part of the hashtag hip hop ed conversation that happens every Tuesday night on Twitter. So when we talk about hip hop in education, when we talk about hip hop in fine arts, with the explosion of Hamilton, with all of the ways that hip hop is now becoming sort of maybe a buzzword, for lack of a better term, in some of these non-traditional spaces, what's the concern there, where we have this that we continue to have sort of an authentic approach to merging hip hop with education and counseling and some of these other fields?
Well, the concern is that it's about youth experience, right? It's about the experience of urban communities. That's what hip hop has always been. And every time it's been commercialized, right, whether it's the B-boy, whether it's the MC, you see folks starting to engage in it for money. You see a lot of different, sort of reasons that folks try to commercialize it. But ultimately what you see is that the work starts to move further away from being focused on the direct experiences and real experiences of, the creators of the work. In this work of urban of education and using hip hop in educational spaces, it's about students and their experiences and them being able to their experiences authentically. And the more we try to concretize and create curriculum, or just think it's cool to spit a rap real quick here and there as a teacher in a classroom, the further we get from understanding that this is a culture, this is a form of expression, this is a way that young people can show us how to fix our schools, right? Young people can take this work in whatever direction they want to take this work. The fear is that we lose out on that sort of organic process of hip hop to grow authentically if we try to commercialize it. It's the same sort of commercialization process that we've seen happen historically. So hip hop education, in my opinion, right, and the opinions of others as well, is just another element in that, right? It's just this new lane that is in this authentic place, but is also being threatened by inauthentic versions of it. And it's about helping young people harness the fact that they are hip hop and what they have to say is valued and is original. And we can't. We have to let this be a process that's guided by youth, and it has to be authentic and rooted in their experiences. And I think that the more we commercialize it, the further we get away from that.
All right. Well, I think that the more we talk about not commercializing it, the better we are at protecting against that from happening, because we definitely don't want to see this happen, as we've seen in entertainment world and other ways that hip hop has been, like you said, kind of smack flipped and rubbed down in ways that aren't always authentic to the culture. But you, sir, do a great job at advocating for that. Your colleagues, people who have given you the chance to do this kind of work. Shout out to everyone who's made your path possible. And I thank you again for sharing your perspectives with me in this format. It's great to talk to you. I've seen you, talk and present a couple of times, and your passion and drive is so apparent. I'm really honored that you took the time to be one of the inaugural guests on this new endeavor. So thank you.
I really, appreciate that as well. And thank you. And yes, definitely huge shout out to folks who have mentored me. So the Hip Hop Ed Camp, Dr. Chris Emden, my colleague, my Edmund Ajapong as well, and
got him lined up too. By the way, he's gonna holler too.
Okay, dope. He's fantastic, man. Yeah, you got to get him on here. He's a beast. So, thank you so much for just creating a space for us to talk critically about this work, man. It's really appreciated.
I appreciate your appreciation. All right, well, listen, have a good time up there in Boston, and
I will, man.
Good luck with everything. Let me just say, once again, thank you for your time, and look forward to crossing paths again soon.
Hip Hop Can Save America is a presentation of the Center for Hip Hop Advocacy at hiphopadvocacy.org, a nonprofit dedicated to increasing public understanding of hip hop culture. We're also brought to you by the Newsbeat podcast, hard-hitting journalism, including interviews with thought leaders and activists about the most pressing social justice issues of our time. It also incorporates hip hop with music and original lyrical contributions every episode. Think of it as Democracy Now! And Black Thought had a podcast baby. Find Newsbeat by More Creative Studios wherever you get your podcasts, or on the web at usnewsbeat.com. Hip Hop Can Save America with Manny Faces airs weekly, Tuesdays at 10 p.m. on Bonfire Open Source Radio. With amazing programming like their flagship morning show TK in the AM, Bonfire Open Source Radio is leading community radio into the future. Check them out at bonfireradio.com or on the TuneIn app. Hip Hop Can Save America is created and hosted by me, Manny Faces. I also produced the theme music. Special thanks to our associate producer, Summer McCoy. You can find out more about me at mannyfaces.com. And find out more about Summer's hip-hop and tech-related initiative, Hip Hop Hacks, at hiphophacks.com. Thank you for listening.